Samuel, Samuel. And he said, Here I am, and ran to Eli and said, Here I am, for you called me. But he, that is Eli, said, I did not call. Lie down again. So Samuel went and lie down. The Lord called again, Samuel. Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, Here I am, for you called me. But Eli said, I did not call, my son, lie down again. Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The Lord called Samuel again a third time, and he got up and he went to Eli, and he said, Here I am, for you called me. Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, Go, lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, Speak, for your servant is listening. So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Now the Lord came and stood there, calling as before, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, Speak, for your servant is listening. As Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was a trustworthy prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the world. Amen. Thanks be to God. So you all might know this, you might not know this. My brother lives in Wyoming, Michigan. He's a pastor. My dad, who lives in Bourbon, Illinois, he's a pastor. My uncle, who lives in Grand Rapids, Michigan, he's a pastor. My grandfather, who lives in Bourbon, Illinois now, was a pastor. My great-grandfather, my grandmother's father, was a pastor. He was actually a district superintendent on the Eastern Michigan District. The Tabernacle at Water's Edge Camp in Howell, Michigan is named after E.W. Martin. Y'all might think I had no choice at all but to become a pastor. It's in the genes, I think, but I'll tell you the truth. If I had had it my way, I would have never been a pastor. That's not to say I don't enjoy and find fulfilling in being your pastor. I certainly do. I just did not intend on going into the family business. It wasn't my plan. It's not what I thought I was going to do. I started college as a secondary history teacher major, high school history teacher. That's what I was going to study, to be a high school history teacher. But I didn't like education classes. I didn't like learning about education at the time, which is hilarious because now I'm in an intensive course about how to teach at Calvin Seminary. So I changed my major, and I didn't know what to study. I changed my major about 5 times in college, and I found that I really liked to study philosophy and theology and religion. So I picked up an academic degree, history. I had one major, history, and then another degree, which was philosophy and theology. And I graduated college in 2009. I just thought, I don't know what I'm going to do with my life. All my friends were going into their respective fields, and I didn't know what to do, so I thought, well, I'll just stay in school. I don't know what else to do. I'll just keep studying. You know, just a little more student debt never hurt anybody. Just stay in school. So Nazarene Theological Seminary called me after I graduated from college, and I thought, well, that'll be about as good a place as any to study. So they called in the middle of December after I graduated that May, and then I was hanging out and was taking classes at Olivet when I got the call from the seminary in December saying, hey, why don't you come and study here? And I said, okay, and moved the first week of January, 2 weeks later. Started my semester, moved into this rinky-dink little apartment in downtown Kansas City. Some people, I am told, hear the call from a young age, and they know from that point on that they're going to be a pastor, that they're going to be in the ministry. And I don't know if God was saying it to me, but I can tell you I wasn't hearing it. I went to seminary not with the intention of going and being a pastor. I went to seminary to study theology academically. I was going to get a PhD. I was going to go become a professor. I was going to go write. I went into seminary pursuing an academic degree that would help me write and teach theology for undergraduate students, maybe graduate students, and that seemed like, at the time, a worthwhile pursuit. I felt like, well, God can use me to further his kingdom and help make the church a good and beautiful place by teaching and by writing. I don't need to go into the family business of being a pastor. That seems a little too messy. I kind of like the sterile environment of the classroom. But I will never forget this moment that stood out as a moment of clarity to me. And it might sound like a strange place to hear God's call, but I remember being in the middle of a research project in the library at the seminary. I was studying, I don't know. I was researching something, working on a paper I had to write. And I remember the voice of the Lord speaking to me in that moment. I can't tell you what I was working on or why that assignment was important, but I can tell you that in the middle of my studies, I sensed the presence of God about me. And do you know what he said to me? You know what God said to me in that moment? God said, "So you're going to be a professor, huh?" And I kind of looked up from my book. And the way that the Lord asked me that question, "You're going to be a professor, huh?" he asked me. I replied hesitantly to the Lord, "Yeah. Is that okay?" I remember asking the Lord that question, "Is that okay?" And this is what I remember so clearly from that dialogue with the Lord. I asked him if it was okay for me to be a professor, and this was his response. This was one of the clearest moments I've heard the voice of the Lord, and he said to me, "Yes, that is okay. You can be a teacher. You can be a professor. I can use you for my purposes in that field." And I said, "I feel like there's a but in there, God." And the Lord said, "No, there is no but to this. Just know, I can and will use you for my bride as a professor, but just know that that's the safer choice." What do you mean? What do you mean that's the safer choice? And the Lord said, "It's a fine choice. You can take it. Lots of people do it, and I've called specific people for that purpose. It is perfectly appropriate for people to do that field. But just know that for you doing that, you will be working on the church from the outside. From the outside in, not from the inside out." He said, "You can do that. That's okay. Just know that if you go the strictly academic route, you will be looking at the church and talking about it from the outside in." And I said, "So you're telling me I have to be a pastor? You're telling me I have to be a fourth generation Nazarene pastor?" And God said, "No, I am not. You have freedom to choose. But if you want to serve the church, if you want to serve my bride, if you think that I am calling you to help her become who she needs to be, know that you're pursuing the safer route. That maybe it's worthwhile to consider operating from within it." I had been kind of dancing around the call, maybe for half a decade. I was half in the call, but I was maintaining it out. I'm pursuing theological academic work so that I can kind of be around the field. But when God called me on my half in, half outness, I knew that I needed to recognize that for years he had been calling me to full-time ministry, and I was just avoiding that call with other good and meaningful alternatives. Because, church, you can avoid the call of God with meaningful things. You can avoid yourself from God's calling on your life with really good things. And that makes it real easy to justify. It sounds silly to say, but I was already well into my seminary career. I was 2 years into graduate school at seminary before I could acknowledge that God had called me to pastoral ministry. Normally, that's why you go to seminary. I heard the Lord say to me, don't kid yourself. If you want to serve my bride, you need to be a part of it. You need to be in it. That's what he said to me. But I was afraid of what it might mean for me to commit to full-time pastoral ministry. Now, I know that God calls people in different ways to different things, and I don't want to say that God only calls people to full-time pastoral ministry. Certainly, God is calling many of us to many things. But I also don't want to dismiss that God still calls people to full-time pastoral ministry. I don't want to deny that that is still the case. And personally, it's been really fun and quite an honor to be able to walk alongside Pastor Justin, who 9 years ago, when you guys moved back to Hastings, you felt called to this area, but you didn't know why, really. And to be present with Pastor Justin and Heather as God has been calling them deeper and deeper. God is still calling people to pastoral work. And as we continue in our Epiphany series today that is called Future Echo, I'm emphasizing, as maybe is evident, the call. As we think about what it means to hear God's call in our lives, it brings to the surface a lot of questions like, well, how do I know when it is God calling me and not something or someone else, my own voice maybe? Or questions like, well, how on earth am I going to actually make this happen? How is this going to be fulfilled in my life? Or then that one question that nags so many people, what if I'm not qualified? What if I'm not ready? How do I know? You see, our series right now is called Future Echo because when God reveals himself to us and calls us, it is often an echo. God calls us through an echo, not an echo of what was, but an echo of what will be. Let me illustrate this. This is maybe a little bit silly, but Kayla and I have a baby monitor for Maddie. We have a baby monitor for both kids. That's pretty standard. But for Maddie's, it's a little unique in that it has a little bit of a delay in the sound. Sometimes Kayla and I will forget to turn it off when we get her up from a nap or get her up in the morning, whatever it might be, when she wakes up. And that monitor is so sensitive. And our house is wooden floors and the noise travels very easily that it picks up virtually any sound in the house. A door shuts, 2 seconds later, we hear the click. It does not relay the sound in real time. It's an echo. There's like a 2-second delay between when a noise is made in the house and when the monitor plays it back. So sometimes, very rarely, sometimes, this doesn't happen a lot, but I will be talking to Kayla or to one of the kids, and a few seconds later, I or Kayla will hear our own voices come back through the monitor. And I often think, not often, this doesn't happen a lot. It happens more than I like to admit, but I think I'll hear my own voice come through the monitor 2 seconds later and say, oh, I don't like how that sounded. Is that how I sound when I talk to my kids? Was that my tone? Did I actually say those words? I didn't hear them when I said them, but 2 seconds later, they're coming to my own ears. Is that how I sound? And then what do? I don't change my tone. I just turn the monitor off so I don't have to hear myself. Because echoes reveal ourselves to us. When we hear our own voices, we hear ourselves as we really are, not as we imagine we are. How many of you guys like to hear your own voice on a recording? Why? We don't like to hear our own voices. We don't like to hear how we sound. And now I'm standing like directly under these speakers and I got my own voice in my own head. We all sound different in our own heads. We don't always hear the tone we use when we're speaking to people. But when the baby monitor speaks your own voice back to you 2 seconds later, you can't ignore it. You hear yourself as you really are. That's what echoes do. And this is how the call of God works in our lives. It is an echo. Only listen, church. The echo of God in your life in that call is not an echo of what we have said in the past or who we have been in the past. The echo of God's call is not an echo of what was, it is an echo of what could be. God's call is an echo of our potentiality. You see, God does not call you because of who you have been. God does not call us because we have merited His call, because we have been so worthy of it, because we've worked so hard at it, because we have made ourselves qualified for it. God doesn't call us from our past. God calls us from His future. And today I read from 1 Samuel chapter 3 about this would-be prophet Samuel. And the text says that he was only a boy. That means he's like less than 13 years old. He's a kid. He's a child. I'm telling you, I've hung around with preteen boys. There is no way that he merited that call. There's no way he could have earned the call. He hadn't done anything to qualify himself for it. God did not call the young boy Samuel to be a prophet because of who he had been or because of who he was, but because of who God knew he would be if he would be obedient to the call. And if I may, I think this is one of the reasons that so many people struggle to hear the call of God on their lives. Not because God says you're not qualified, but because we disqualify ourselves. Because I'm unworthy. I don't have the skill set. I don't have what it takes. They think they don't have the ability to speak publicly, but God didn't care about that with Moses. They think they don't have the pedigree, but God didn't care about that in David. They think that they have the wrong experiences. They've entered the wrong field at a young age. They just don't have what it takes. But Jesus didn't care about that with the disciples. When God calls us, it isn't He who disqualifies us, but we who disqualify ourselves because of who we have been. God doesn't look at our past and say, you don't make the cut. God isn't calling you because who you have been, but because of who you will be when you say yes to the call. God calls us from His beautiful future, not our broken past. And if I can be completely transparent with you, when I talk to pastors, I do believe that God calls people to save them. That there are some who, if they did not say yes to the call, would be really hard for them to be faithful to the church. So you guys are looking at me on a platform as your pastor who talks at you every week. And maybe I need to be more clear about this more often, but I look up to y'all so much for your faithfulness. Because what reward do you have for being here? What gain is it for you to give up an hour and a half or 2 hours on a Sunday morning to be as faithful to the life of the church and the presence of God in your lives, some of us need to be called to the pastorate in order to do that. So I look up to you and I appreciate that. So the question remains, how do we discern God's calling on our lives? Let's say we don't automatically disqualify ourselves and we have this openness to it. How are we to know that it comes from the Lord, and how are we to know in which direction to go? Because for me and my call, it felt like there were two paths that looked so similar. How am I to know which course to take? I thought I should go this academic route, but now all of a sudden there's another path open to me in pastoral ministry. How do we know which path is the Lord's and maybe which one is just a thought that we've had in our own heads? Well, I think the text reveals that to us a little bit in the relationship between Samuel and Eli. I think one way to know is that we can rely on the testimony of others. The church says they see that call in you. You see, Samuel didn't know that it was the voice of the Lord for 3 times. Samuel heard the voice of the Lord calling him 3 times, and each time he thought it was Eli. How was it? How was it that Samuel came to an understanding that it was the Lord who was calling him? It's because someone said to him, "That's the Lord. That's God." This is what happened to Samuel. Samuel didn't know that it was the Lord calling until Eli pointed it out to him. And if the community of faith says that they see in you the call of God upon your life, chances are you have a call on your life. When the gathering of God's people say that they believe that God has a special purpose for you, maybe God is speaking through his people. But at the same time, church, when the people of God, the church, the bride, say that they see in someone the call to ministry, they similarly have an obligation to that person to help them realize that call personally, emotionally, relationally, academically, and financially. Eli had an obligation to raise Samuel into his call. And if a body of believers says that they believe God has called someone to be a minister, well, then that body of believers needs to make sure that that person has every opportunity to fulfill that call. When churches can't support, either practically, corporately, whatever it might be, people that they testify to having God's call, the truth is they hurt themselves and they diminish what opportunities they have. But also they could potentially be stifling the call of God in that one who has been called. Because here's the thing about calling. Calling is communal. Hear this, church. Calling is collective. We see this in the witness of Eli, Samuel's mentor. The burden of the calling is on both the one being called as well as on the community to which they have been called. Calling is communal. But at the same time, it's personal. It's personal. God called Samuel by name. As we read earlier this morning in the first chapter of John, Philip said to Nathanael, "Hey, we've seen the guy. We found him." Nathanael says, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And Philip says, "Well, come and see." And what happens when Nathanael goes to see the Christ? What does Jesus say to him? Nathanael. Jesus calls him by name. And he's still calling us by name. To call someone by name is no small thing. How do your parents get your attention when they really need you to pay attention? When you're not hearing them and they really need you to pay attention, what do? Oh, middle name gets added. And if you go by a nickname, you get the full name. I knew I needed to pay attention when I heard, "Daniel Mark." When I heard Daniel Mark, I was in trouble. And if in a board meeting a few months ago, I forget the context of what we were talking about, but Robin Chase says, Danny, what's your middle name? And I said, why? And she said, I just need to know your middle name. I said, it's Mark. She said, Daniel Mark. She was my surrogate mother in that meeting. Oh, I mean, a name matters. A few months ago, when Kayla and I were in the transition that we had, when Kayla and the girls were staying at my parents' house, I went down and Kayla was up here in Grand Rapids, and we were invited to a dinner. We went to dinner with, he was my choir director. Kayla was invited as well, but she was here in Michigan for work. So I took the girls to Jeff Bell, Dr. Bell's house with my parents. And at the end of the dinner, my choir director, we'd had a whole lot of fun, played a whole bunch of games. But I was taking the girls back to the house to go to bed. And he said, hey, Millie. And she said, yeah. He said, Millie, do you give hugs? And he's a sweet man who had no malintent when he asked Millie, but I could tell that Millie wasn't comfortable giving him a hug. She looked up at me, and I gave her the signal that she didn't need to give him a hug. And so she said to him, yes, I do give hugs, but I don't know your name. Okay. I was blown away by such an appropriate response to someone she didn't want to give a hug. I do give hugs, but I don't know your name. What she was saying was, I don't know you. I'm not comfortable being vulnerable with you because I don't know you. God calls us by name. God called Samuel and Nathaniel by name because God knows them. God calls those he knows. His calling is personal. When God calls you, you can trust the call because he knows you. And he wouldn't call you if he didn't know you. And if I can be really, really direct, when we deny the call of God on our lives, it could be that we are displaying a lack of trust in God. When we disqualify ourselves and say, I don't know what to do, I'm not qualified, I don't have the skills, I can't do that or be that, what we're saying is, God, I don't trust you to make me the person that I need to be. God knows us and sees within us the fulfillment of his purposes. And this is why God's calling on our lives can be scary, church. Not just to pastoral ministry, but to anything we are called to, because when we are called, we are seen. We can't hide behind the masks we put on. God calls us in community. It is communal. And God calls us by name. It is personal. But the other thing about the call of God on your life is that it just doesn't quit. God's calling is persistent. You could say it's persistent. You could say that God's calling is nagging, maybe even. But when Samuel was called, God called him 4 times. You know what happens when I have to call my kids 4 times? If I get to 3 times and you're not responding, God called him 4 times. I can't tell you how many times God called me. I can't, because I wasn't listening. When God called me to ministry, I just imagined he meant other really meaningful and other good jobs. But when he called me, he would call me closer and closer, a little bit more within his call. And then the next time he would speak to me, it was just a little bit more. Church, God is persistent. He does not give up. And we need to be careful not heeding the call that he gives us because he's not going to stop. And in truth, when we don't heed his call, we can miss out on who he is making us to be. We might just miss out on the transformation that he has for us. And I believe that God is calling us, maybe even every single one of us, for his purposes. Maybe not to full-time ministry, Maybe not to full-time pastoral ministry, but also maybe. Maybe there's a call on our lives to raise a family free of the generational trauma that has plagued our families for decades. Maybe God is calling your generation to stop that system of brokenness that has been passed on from generation to generation. Church, that is a hard call to fulfill. But good night, is it a good one and an important one? God, I believe, is calling women and men to raise families committed to His kingdom. God is even calling women and men to be faithful grandparents. Maybe God is calling you to be the supportive spouse that you never experienced with your parents. And I don't care how old you are, it's never too late to be that. Maybe God is calling you to be a surrogate parent for someone you see doesn't have the support and the care that is expected by their parents. You see, these are just examples, but God calls many of us to many things, not just to pastoral ministry, if we will but have the courage to say to Him, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." Now, I'm going to wrap things up a little bit here. I'm closing up shop, I promise. But I just want to end by talking about the statue of David. In Florence, Italy, stands one of the most impressive pieces of sculpture ever crafted. The statue of David, sculpted 500 years ago, over 500 years ago now. It still stands as one of the seven wonders of the world. It is magnificent. It is ridiculous. If you've ever been to Florence, Italy, and you've seen the statue of David, pictures do not do it justice. You walk into the room, you see him, and you're just like, you're blown away. It is unfathomable what Michelangelo did with a piece of marble. And when he was asked about carving the statue of David, Michelangelo said the following: "I created a vision of David in my mind and simply carved away everything that was not David." He created a vision of David in his mind and had a marble slab and cut away everything that was not David in that marble slab. He saw David in trash and chiseled and chiseled and chiseled until David was freed from the stone. When God calls us, He calls us corporately. Eli raises Samuel. Michelangelo chisels away at David. He calls us personally. He calls us by name, and he's persistent. He doesn't stop calling. He keeps his hammer and chisel at the ready to carve away all the things that aren't His vision for us. But know this, church: He does not call us because of who or what or where we have been, but because He sees within us a vision of something. And when He calls us and sees that within us, He will carve away everything that is not who He has made you to be. You see, God's call is not an echo of who we have been, but an echo of who He could make us to be, if we would but say yes. I'll be honest, it might take some chiseling. If you don't want to have parts of yourself that you've constructed knocked off, then don't answer God's call on your life. God will do some cutting away. God will do some hammering. But the call of God is Him making us who He sees we can be, not who we have been. God calls us not because we have a perfect family history. I sometimes laugh when I hear people talk about biblical family values. Name one family in the Bible that has biblical family values. David? No. God doesn't call us because we have a good pedigree. God calls us because He knows that we could be the one to break the cycle of family generational brokenness. God calls us not because we had a great example of what it meant to be a supportive spouse. God calls us because He sees in us someone who doesn't have to make history repeat itself. God calls us for His purposes because He sees who we can be if we would just obey His call. Now, I want to leave you with this quote from Father Richard John Newhouse, who begins by referencing many commonly held beliefs. He quotes these commonly held beliefs. You are what you think you are. You are what you want to be. You are what you feel you are. He continues the quote, no, we are what we are called to be in obedience to the vocation we have accepted as ours. I do it all for the sake of the gospel that I may share in its blessings. We are what the gospel promises we will be. That is the call. To full-time pastoral ministry? Yeah, sure, you better believe it. But not only to full-time pastoral ministry. God is calling us to deeper faithfulness, to deeper fidelity, to deeper purpose. And what we are is we are what the gospel promises we will be. So, church, God is calling you. Do you hear him? This is the good news of Jesus Christ for us today.